Hi, I'm Arjun Malhotra. I'm founder and GP at Good Capital.
Welcome to the Founder Thesis podcast, Arjun. Uh, did you grow up in India? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in India until I was about 13, and then I was at boarding school in the UK, in university in the UK. But back and forth a lot.
And how did that happen? Getting to UK, did your parents move there or something?
No,
How did
actually,
you?
I'm from an army family, but my father got into the education business, and he sort of romanticized the idea of a British boarding school education, and so it was his dream that my brother and I would go get sent to a British boarding school, which was a fantastic experience. But I think that was just from his time in the education business with the global educators conferences, and he wanted us to have that experience. And so once we were there at school, it was pretty natural to have university and everything else abroad as well.
So how did you end up being a GP of a venture fund in India, being an entrepreneur in India?
Well, I mean, I was much more interested in the product side of things. So it was a little accidental in the sense that through my time at university, I ended up interning at and being at a fund called Capricorn, which was Jeff Skoll, the eBay co-founder, his private investment fund, based in Palo Alto. And so I was in my early 20s, absolutely blown away by what was happening in the consumer internet at that point. That was 2010 to 2012, 2013 or so. So that's really when the consumer platforms that we use today, that are the incumbents, were early scalers, so companies like Facebook, Twitter was still in their very early days. And so it was a pretty special experience being in Silicon Valley at that point.
And what kind of deals did you see?
Well, the fund was a lot more focused on clean tech. So they were the first investors in Tesla, SpaceX, Planet Labs, electric hydrogen, Joby Aviation, a bunch of incredible companies. But my excitement was the consumer side. So how I ended up then being a GP was I decided to come back to India in 2013. We started Investopad as a product studio. So we were co-building products. But eventually the ecosystem was so early.
One question about the product studio.
Yeah.
Did you see examples of that in the US? Is there a product studio example just to relate with?
Yeah, there's quite a few. There's BetaWorks, there's Idea Labs. I mean, Rocket Internet was doing it in a way which probably wasn't as original as some of the other ones. But it's not a model. Expa is another one, but it's not a model that scales so much, to be honest with you.
Why is that?
Well, I think I can speak for us, right? Because some of the names I mentioned have been a lot more successful than we were. For us, what ended up happening was we were so early and so plugged into the ecosystem that we'd meet other people who were already doing startups, and they don't want to co-build things with you. So there's an adverse selection problem, which is the best entrepreneurs don't ask for permission. They're already doing interesting things. And so if you're looking to co-build with different teams, you're then not necessarily bringing on, it's a little harder to find talent to do it. And that's sort of how we ended up in investing accidentally, which is that we had these great founders already doing things that we were seeing were working. We weren't investors, but we were sort of compelled to put a little bit of money into what they were doing. And we did that for 4 or 5 years before we realized that actually now we should do it more full time.
Is a venture studio the same thing as a product studio?
I think venture firms probably do venture studios now, whereas product studio. Yeah. So I don't think that it's the exact thing, just because of how a fund is deploying capital. So you just set aside an allocation and you're kind of investing out of it into external entrepreneurs. And I think the difference with the product studio is your core team is builders. So you're trying to build something and then scale it by hiring talent and putting talent and bringing in talent to pretty senior level. So it's more like we're co-founding the company together, and instead of a 10 to 12%, 15% ESOP pool, it's a 50, 60% ESOP pool in a venture studio model. In a product studio model. Whereas in the venture studio model, it's almost a way just to scout founders.
Oh, okay. Got it. Okay.
I'm not sure. These are
And
not super established ideas. The sample
yeah,
size
yeah,
of
yeah.
these is very small.
Right. The industry evolves very fast as
Yeah.
well. Um, so it- you did you build a team of coders and UI UX designers? I mean, to build a product, you essentially need like people who write code and people who design
Yeah.
and product managers. You built that whole team.
We went more product specific. So we started a product first, then we built a team around it. And then the idea would be to move on to subsequent products. But the truth is that after two, we were basically just spending more of
What was
our.
the first one? Just
The first
tell me
one
the
was
journey.
something called
Yeah.
Direction Wala. And so the way it worked is that if it was like before the mobile internet was so good, if you wanted to get somewhere, you would like people would always call 10 minutes before being like, okay, how do I get to the office? यहाँ से कहाँ से left लेना है? फिर वहाँ से क्या करना है? And so it would then tie up local guys in the neighborhood, like the guy at the Kirana store, or the guy who's got a taxi stand or something. And you'd put a phone number in your calendar invite, or you'd just have this toll-free number that you'd call. It would redirect to someone locally within the vicinity who'd visually know where you could be, have a conversation with you, and then direct you to where to go.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean these
Okay.
were terrible ideas, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Yeah, I was trying to politely say
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, thank God it didn't work out.
Okay. Okay. And what was the next one?
The next one was equally terrible. Actually, I still think something like it could exist, but it's like the standard thing that anyone who's trying to build a tech product for the first time tries to build, which is it would look at like different. It's any guy who has started to build a tech product. One of the first things they'll try and build is something that helps you find out that your friends have been in the same place. So it was one of those things where it's like, have you been in the
Okay.
same area
Okay.
before? And then it'll ping you if you've overlapped or are overlapping at that time.
Like a check-in location based
Kind
kind
of,
of a.
yeah, yeah. And we
Okay.
were doing it more at
Okay.
a city level than a hyper local level. So it was, I mean, it felt like a better identified segment of people who travel more, but yeah, no.
Now, how are you funding the development of these two products? And because you did not, you're not intending to raise external capital for this until it reached, let's say, post PMF kind of a stage. Uh, and you spent 4 years in the product studio model. How
Yeah.
did you fund those 4 years?
Well, firstly, I didn't get paid is a big part of it, and me and my brother were the founding team, so we didn't pay ourselves. And then when we like part of starting the studio was about how do you attract talent, and so what we then wanted to do. This is before even co-working spaces were a thing. Was we said how do we create a hub that attracts talent? And so Investopad in Gurgaon was the first physical place to do it, and we subsidized the capital that would go into creating some of these products by bringing on larger scale startups and charging them for the co-working side of things. And again, those incentives are not well aligned. So the business for us just didn't make sense. I think we'd have been a lot better served if we could have raised a ton of capital for it, been able to hire a large enough team rather than being too sensitive about equity valuation, at that point.
So you essentially ended up running a co-working space, being involved in all the operational challenges which that brings with it.
I was frankly not too involved with the operational challenges of it. But yeah, I think like half the business ended up basically being a co-working space. And we shut that down over the next few years. But I tried to focus my energies more on the product side of things. But yeah, I think you can't really have split focus when you're trying to do one thing. So it definitely made it difficult.
These two products, when did you realize that they're not working out?
Very early, and then you move on to the next one.
And how many products total did you do?
There were a lot of smaller things that we would have hacked together. So in total, I would think probably 8 to 10 or so. These are the two that we probably more meaningfully stuck at for a longer period of time. But then the other thing we'd start to do is that the promising startups that were coming to Investopad, we'd start helping them a little bit. So we'd help them with go to market. we met a lot of people in the ecosystem quite early on and got entrenched quite early. So we were able to help them raise capital. So we weren't really sure what we were going to end up doing, right? And so it was more just about being quite open-minded about finding interesting things and getting our hands dirty that finally led us to say that, it turns out after making 12 investments over those 4 years, that the portfolio was quite good and maybe we had some kind of a skill in investing.
How did you get so networked in the startup ecosystem? Was it because you were offering a place, like a co-working place for startups, before any WeWork or any such option existed, purely because of that, or you're just good at networking, or because you were helping in fundraise, and so that would have automatically
I think it was all of
strengthened?
it. A big part of it was just being early, right? And then the second part of it is, the co-working was a small aspect of what was happening at Investopad. At that time, there were a lot of enthusiasts about tech and about startups, and they didn't have anywhere to really meet like-minded people, or find co-founders, or even do stuff like hackathons. So we hosted a bunch of these things, and it's the weekends and evenings that were busier than the weekdays. And so it kind of became a hub of activity. And because of that, we were a pretty central node in a lot of what was going on. And so it became easier. If your mindset is to connect like-minded people who are doing interesting things, and you do that over even 2 or 3 years, at that stage of the ecosystem, it went a really long way.
So essentially, what Investopad gave you more than anything was a community play.
Yeah, it helped us.
Like
It helped us really build our early
Yeah.
network there, I think.
Like not like a formal thing, but essentially you build a community of startup enthusiasts by hosting regular events and meetups and stuff
Totally.
like
And
that.
like for me, that was
Became
a
a
big
play.
learning from being in the Valley, which is that if you've got a lot of smart people who are doing interesting things and you're just putting them all you're putting them all together, it creates a lot of opportunity and things just start to happen. It's not a it's not a predictable formula, but the more you do it, the greater the odds that something interesting will happen.
Okay. When did you finally decide to exit the co-working part of the business?
It was phased, like I said, because it didn't take up a lot of my time personally over the years. It kept running until relatively recently. I think 2019 is probably when we shut down the majority of it. But I wasn't spending more than a day every couple months on it, even at that point.
Did you give up the space also, or does the space continue as a
So we had
community
three
place?
studios. We had Gurgaon, we had Delhi right opposite IIT Delhi main gate. And then we had one in Koramangala in Bangalore. And we actually we shut it down sort of accidentally because there was a sewage leak in the building on 80 Feet Road. And so we said we're going to change buildings, and so we shut it down. And as we were looking for a new one, it was probably around when the pandemic happened, and so we just never got around to it. So maybe closer to 2020, and then the SDA one was where our team was, and I think in 2018 we were maybe 4 people, and we just grew, and so we just stopped taking new people in. And I think it's now been probably 4 years since anyone else was in there, and the SDA one is exclusively our office. And then Gurgaon wound down maybe, like 3 or 4 years ago. I hadn't been there in a while at that point. I'd been exclusively focused on investing for a long time by then.
Okay. I mean, what I'm trying to understand is community your USP? That you have a community first approach to building a VC fund. Is that a USP, or that was how you got started, build credibility by getting a good portfolio together, and now you are a more serious VC like the other VC funds?
I think more than community, it's a network-driven approach that's really supported us even at the beginning as well as now. And I'll explain how that is. So I think as a tech-focused VC, people talk about tech as if it's a vertical. It's not. It's a horizontal, growing across every single industry. And so if you're an early-stage investor and you're specialized in tech, you could need to know everything about every single vertical or build a huge team where you've got specialists that are doing that. Or if you're very early stage, then you kind of need to be a generalist. And so our network became a huge advantage because we'd come across people who we thought were incredibly talented, doing incredibly interesting things. Now, did we know whether what they were building had legs? We weren't sure about that because that then becomes a vertical specific question. And so it became natural to say that, hey, we know this other person who's spent the last 15 years building a business in this space, and these three other people who've dealt with the same issues around like the chicken and egg of the supply side liquidity of marketplaces, for instance. So why don't you go talk to those people? And so that would help the entrepreneurs. What we didn't realize initially was that it would also help us get an insider's view on the company and give us the conviction we needed to be able to invest in those companies. So that approach very much remains the case today as well, which is we acknowledged very, very early on that we're not going to be the people who know everything about everything, but if we can find some of the top people in the country who have really have a lot of experience in sectors or have dealt with a lot of the current challenges of building and scaling companies, that can be a lot more beneficial to the portfolio than what we as GPs of the team can bring. And that wasn't the initial idea. The initial idea was as we moved towards building a venture fund, would we build these huge platform teams and portfolio services teams? That's what made sense to me, but I don't think that's what happens.
Okay. What are these platform teams, portfolio services teams? What do they do? Just help me understand what is the org chart of a fund.
I mean,
what are the functions within the fund?
It depends on what the model is, right? A lot of VC funds go after different models. So the Andreessen Horowitz model is to have huge platform teams. They'll have salespeople who are.
What is a platform team?
Yeah, so a platform team can be across different verticals. It can be, they'll have a recruitment function. A platform team is basically a centralized team that's treating the portfolio in the old sense if it was a conglomerate, almost as if they were subsidiaries or divisions within a large company, but you're centralizing a lot of the core aspects of the business, amortizing those costs.
Like a shared services.
Shared services, and some of them have done it really well, right? So Andreessen Horowitz, as I was talking about, has a huge recruitment team. They've almost got an independent recruitment business inside Andreessen Horowitz. They've also got huge sales teams. So they've got people within different sectors of different industries who are attending all of the conferences, who are out there. They are known by industry players. So if you're an Andreessen Horowitz portfolio company, they can help you with a lot of your larger sales. You can also have shared services like UI, UX, design, like marketing, almost agency kind of stuff as well. So in the early days, I used to think that is the right way to build a venture capital firm, be able to offer a lot of these shared services to portfolio companies. But then you also have other venture capital models. So you have much more specialized ones where the GP group remains really small. Every GP is an independent decision maker, and they each run their own portfolio of companies. And they're just kind of a group of people who meld well together, but are maybe focused on different sectors. And then the third model you have is similarly very focused on the GPs. But when you raise from a fund like that, you're not stuck with a relationship through just one GP. You can have 5 or 6 different ones.
Okay. Interesting. In India, which are the funds which have invested in platforms? Like you gave me Andreessen Horowitz from the US.
Yeah.
Who are like?
I believe Peak 15's done it to a certain extent. Elevation does it to a certain extent as well. In the way Elevation, I've noticed it more with Elevation because we have a couple co-investments with them. So they do a couple of things that are actually really helpful for companies, mainly around setting up their financial systems. So one of the things that early stage founders who are pre-seed seed going towards an A always have to reckon with is how do I build my financial systems? So not just creating my MIS, but how does information like actual transaction flows from the business get updated and close to real time so that I can have a live handle on what's happening in the business. And I've seen them help with that in the past. But yeah, I don't think in India anyone's doing it in anywhere as as involved a way as Andreessen Horowitz does.
Is there a merit in one approach over the other approach? So, and I'll just recap my understanding. So, one approach sounds like the Berkshire Hathaway approach, where Berkshire Hathaway is not doing anything except for capital allocation, choosing maybe the leaders and maybe setting up an incentive plan, but they're very hands off. And the second is, as you said, the conglomerate approach. What's your take between these two approaches? And
I don't think one is better than the other, but they're very different games. So I think in order to do this shared services approach, you need to be a mega multi-stage fund. It doesn't make sense to do if you're going to stay focused as an early stage fund. There are economies of scale involved in doing it. And if you try and do it at a subscale, it doesn't really work because you're not able to bring on the best talent to be able to do it. And also then what you're doing as a venture fund changes. When you're a mega fund that's multi-stage, you're running a business. You're not an investment firm. You happen to have a team that invests. But actually, there's so many other aspects of running a VC fund, which really are not in the industry as deeply kind of seen or talked about. But I think shared services are something that makes sense at a lot more scale. Which is why there's also, at the other end of the spectrum, you have this solo GP model that emerged over the last few years as well, where you had either past GPs at funds or founders turned investors who are raising capital and are able to raise a meaningful amount of capital that they're just investing without a team. They've outsourced all of the compliance, the operations to an angel list or to a Carta or to some other platforms. So you're seeing those two sort of emerge as well. I think it depends a lot on what the GPs want and what their vision is and what kind of business they want. Like, do they want to run the business or do they want to be investors?
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about the evolution from Investopad to Capital. By the time you decided to do your fund one, how many investments had you done? What were some prominent names?
We done 12 investments.
Which you were doing in your... So these were like your personal capacity?
Yeah, personal capacity. So small investments. We did 12 until 2018. And we'd started doing them in late 2014 or so. So now the problem with them was that we had a limited amount of capital to invest. And so for us to write a check was like a huge opportunity cost of where it could go. It was pretty much it was a zero-sum game in that sense. And so I think looking back at that portfolio 2014 to 2018, it meant that the kind of conviction we had to get to build a portfolio was incredibly high. And what I felt was a big problem with that portfolio while investing was that it was going to be really small. It was always going to be 10 to 12 companies. And the idea that made sense to me when you think about angel investing is that you make lots of little investments. And then when a company starts to do really well and break out, you double down in the winners meaningfully. And we were doing the opposite, not because we wanted to. I wanted to do the lots of little bets model, but because we had no other option. And by the time we got around to 2017, 2018, I became increasingly convinced that this was the right model to do rather than the spray and pray kind of approach. The prominent companies, so there were 12 companies in that portfolio. We had, I believe, 2 shut down. We have 2 that we're still holding, including a third that was acquired by someone else. The 2 that we're still holding and are at some kind of scale are Hypertrack and Misho. And then there were 8 others, which were either acquisitions or secondary sales.
And how much did you make in these 8? Like, did it more than return the entire corpus?
It returned the entire corpus within the first 4 years. Within the first 4 years from the first investment. So by the end of 2018, we'd returned everything we'd invested across all of the companies in cash from the acquisitions. And then obviously beyond that, companies like Amisho have been, close to like 1,000x's on the investment. So it's quite nice.
Like a blended, what would be the blended?
The blended portfolio stands at 50 times what we invested today.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah, the entire portfolio. Yes. And hopefully
And this
there's
is like
a couple more
yeah.
multiples to come from that too.
Okay, amazing. So there's like a constraints forcing a certain business model, which actually ended up being the
Totally.
right model.
Totally. And so I've been a big believer in constraints in general, and it's a constraint we've tried to hold on to. And so the way we do it now is we limit the number of investments we make every year to force the same kind of conviction. Because, we look at, I think it's something like 160, 170 deals a month, which is
Okay.
like on the lower end, it's that. And so you come across a lot of really interesting companies and you want to be able to invest in them. And the problem is if you're not even indisciplined, like if you are just a curious person, the biggest problem you're going to have is you're going to have 5 or 6 that you fall in love with. But then you also have another 20, 25 where they make a lot of sense. You're not quite sure. And if you're sitting on a $50 million fund, like, why shouldn't I put $100,000 into this? Let's see what happens and we'll come back to it. And so optionality is like a pretty silent killer then, I think, because you end up doing lots of
Nice.
that.
Okay, nice. That's very counterintuitive advice about the pitfalls of optionality. Amazing. Okay. Um, so, when did you formally launch a fund?
2019, July 2019 is when we
Right.
launched Good Capital Fund 1. And we did first close. It was supposed to be a 20-ish million dollar fund. The way fundraisers work now is unlike a company raising around, is when a company goes out to raise, they get all their commitments from investors. They raise, they do a dilution for equity, right? Standard. With a fund, you're raising a pool of capital that you're going to invest into companies. And so we raise from LPs, and you're allowed to raise over a longer period of time. So we do something called a first close, which with Fund 1, we did at 16 million. And then you can start investing, and then you normally get 12 months where you can take more capital in. So the more risk averse LPs then start to come in those ensuing 12 months, because you say, like to the first group, you say, this is my strategy, this is why I'm good at sourcing, this is my track record, here's how I see the world, here's what's exciting, bunch of like narrative stuff. Whereas with the second group, you say, look, I told you all of that. Now I'm showing you another 5 or 6 companies. This is what they do. Here's why they're interesting. And we think this company will go on to raise more capital in the next 6 months at this price. So that's typically how you do a fundraise. Now, the problem for us was with Fund 1, we did this first close at 16 million. And then fundraising was going really well. So we were like, you know what? Initial target was 20 to 25. I think we can do 30. And so we got a bunch of verbal commitments. We didn't hold a second close. And then the pandemic happened. And anyone who had verbally committed to us but had not signed anything was suddenly, balls were up in the air, and it was March 2020. And our final close deadline was the first week of July 2020. So that wasn't enough. Even though the sentiment changed pretty drastically after that, there was that 2 or 3 month window which really caught us out.
Yeah.
And so we were then stuck with a $16 million fund, and we had been making our first 4 investments were, I think, $1 million each. And so we had a very skewed portfolio, and then kind of had to deal with how do you reshape the construction of that fund.
Why is $1 million each investment causing it to be skewed? 16 million, so you can invest in 16 companies over a 4-year period, which kind of.
So typically what happens with a fund is you have in a $16 million fund, let's say, you have a 2% management fee. So it's 2% annually. That's 20% taken away over the 10-year period.
10 years.
You might have a few more expenses. And so that brings you down by 3.2 million in that situation. And then you also want to leave some capital to follow on into companies. You don't just make a one shot. Like, it's very rare that a fund will, its entire portfolio construction is 0 reserves. So reserves is what percentage of your fund are you reserving for follow on, whether that's pro rata, whether that's leading future rounds, whatever that may be. In fact, most funds have a higher percentage of their fund be reserves than initial investments. So we are unusual in that sense. Like, our reserves are probably 35% or so. For most funds, it'll be well over 60, 65%.
this would again sound like a very newbie question, but if you are taking a bigger stake early on, aren't you getting more multiples? Like
Yeah,
if I at a 5 million valuation, if I invest 1 million, I get 20%, whereas at a 15 million valuation, I invest 1 million. So, I mean, when you come in later, I assume the 5 would have become 15.
no,
So,
that's exactly right. That's why we put the majority of our investment in the first checks that we write. And again, that's why I believe an approach where you have a high percentage of the fund in reserves is a tougher approach, because then every early check you write is like an optionality check where you start investing in the company, and then as it starts to do well, the multiple actually goes up, and then you invest the majority of the capital. So we don't do that. Like when I was saying it was a problem for us that our first few checks were $1 million checks, it's because the total investable corpus was smaller, and our average check size should have probably been half of that, and so then we had to overcorrect. Um, but actually, it ended up working out quite well. The reason it ended up working out quite well was we went back to our LPs and we said, look, our strategy has been a really concentrated fund. And now, if we have 12 million left out of 16, and we've still got 2.5 years of investing to do, either we can change our strategy a little bit, write smaller checks into more companies, or if we want to be the lead investors in these companies, which was always the goal, then you guys give us capital outside of the fund to co-invest into these companies. And so even though the fund was only 16 million, we actually invested 45 million over that vintage, and we were able to put more capital into each of those companies.
okay, okay, okay. Uh, who were those companies in Fund One? Like prominent
The
names?
first investment was a company called SimSim. And SimSim was an interesting one because we had our verbal commitments from the fund quite early. By the end of 2018, we had 16 million committed. It just took a long time to structure all of it. We were dealing with new things. And so we committed to our first few investments. I think our first 4 or 5 investments we committed months before the fund was actually set up or ready to deploy capital. And I look back at the paperwork, and I think with Simpson, we'd made the commitment like 6 or 7 months before we'd signed documents. And so we were really fortunate that they were good to us and structured the investment in a way that our capital could come a little bit later. Simpson was a really prominent one because that was acquired by Google a year later, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they were doing social commerce, video-based social commerce. There's another company called Entry, which does local language education. And I think they're doing incredibly well as well. There's a company called Wealthy, which is building a platform to help people become wealth managers. And they give them the software to be able to manage their own roster of clients. Solar Square is a company that we invested in as well, which
I interviewed the
Shreya?
Solar Square founder.
Oh,
recently.
really?
Yes, yeah.
Nice, nice. Yeah, so these were some of the early ones.
Okay. Understood. How easy or hard was it to raise money from LPs? Did you target your network, or did you target institutional capital, domestic, international?
We targeted only international capital because you have to make a decision when you're starting a fund whether it's going to be India-based or foreign. And most of where we felt that there'd be a bigger pool of capital at the time was foreign. So we created a foreign fund, and it's easier for them to come into these offshore vehicles. It was a lot harder than
Singapore or
Mauritius
US?
is the standard sort of one that everyone uses with India.
Mm.
But it was a lot harder, I think, to raise the first fund than I would have expected. Just because you think that there are people globally who are interested in the India story, and there are, but it depends a lot on, I mean, a lot of LPs, firstly, are risk averse. Secondly, the type of LP that you target is completely based on your fund size. So if I'm raising a $25 million fund, I can't go to Silicon Valley and raise money from those angels because those angels write $25,000 checks, and you don't want more than 40 investors, let's say, in your fund. But then again, if I'm raising a $25 million fund, I'm way too small for an endowment or a foundation. And then the next rung up from that is sovereign investors. And the reason for that is that those guys are sitting on such large pools of assets under management that it's an equal amount of work, firstly, whether you're writing $1 million investment or a $50 million investment. It doesn't change by a
Right.
50x. It might change by a 3x, but it
Yeah.
doesn't change that
Right.
meaningfully. So it doesn't make sense for them to write really small investments. And so for us, we're kind of in that awkward spot where even today, if you're raising a fund that's between 10 million and 130 million, your target LP is family offices. And family offices are the most opaque part of this LP ecosystem because they are essentially family businesses that are typically generational, that have made capital, have institutionalized a family office that's managing the capital for now what is the third or fourth generation of the family. So it's quite dispersed. There's maybe like 40 people at that point in the family. So they're not really involved. And then you've got these family offices whose mandate, unlike a sovereign, whose mandate is probably to get returns, or an endowment is to continue to kind of beat returns. With a family office, it's preservation of capital. So it doesn't make sense for them to do incredibly high risk stuff. If you're talking about private equity, that's high risk. If you're talking about venture capital, that's even more high risk. If you're talking about venture capital in India, like there's very few that can take that kind of risk. And the problem with venture capital investments is when things go wrong, they go wrong within the first 3 or 4 years. But when things go right, it takes 8 to 10 years for them to actually start to look right. And so if there's a guy who's sitting in Europe writing an investment and doesn't know India very well, to be able to take on that kind of risk really requires a testing, not just to the market risks, the strategy risks, but also the GPs and whether, there's a lot of risks that are layered in there that make it a much tougher bet to make.
How old were you when you were raising in 2019?
Well, we started raising 2017. I was 26, 27 maybe.
How did you manage to raise $20 million as a 27-year-old? Because, like you said, that GP risk. I mean, for someone to give millions of dollars to a 27-year-old kid. I mean, you still look very young. You
Yeah.
have that boyishness in the way you look.
Yeah, well, I think it was a couple of things. Firstly, there were one or two people who took really bold risks on us. So in Fund One, there's a firm that came in and they put in 5 million and they said that we're going to anchor this fund. And we like what, they came to India, they met all of our portfolio, met everyone we worked with, spent time with us. And they said that we believe in this strategy and we think this is going to work. So we want to help get them in business. And getting that main kind of rock helped everything else catalyze, because then you're suddenly saying that this isn't just a strategy, that we've made a certain amount of progress against a milestone. The second thing is time. It took a lot of time. We had a false start in 2016 as well when we tried to fundraise, and someone very quickly indicated a verbal commitment of 8 or 9 million. We were like, okay, great, this is fantastic. This thing's super easy. Yeah. And then it fell apart pretty quickly. So then we had to go back and start from scratch. Okay. So I think time was a big part of it, because we spent a lot of time with these people, meeting them, giving them updates. Like, you're running a marketing process. You're taking all of the updates from your portfolio, especially when you're doing a Fund One, and you're then transforming it in a manner that's relatable to someone who doesn't understand the industry or the ecosystem, and explaining why it's exciting. And also, obviously, the portfolio started to do well. I mean, that being said, a lot of the markups that we have now, we didn't have in 2018. Like, even the Misho was not nearly marked up anywhere near as much as it is now back then. So I'd say time and a couple of people willing to take big, bold risks on us as well. We're quite lucky in that sense.
This 5 million LP, how did you meet him? What led to that happening? Was there some sort of a credibility building that happened through an introduction, or was it purely your pitch?
No, we were introduced through someone that we had met through this Investopad ecosystem that we brought in, that had looked at a bunch of companies alongside us. So he knew we were doing interesting work, and he knew these people.
Okay.
And so he got in touch with them. And this is a firm that had been investing in India until 10 years before, and then they hadn't done anything. And he sort of said that, look, I've known these people for 3 or 4 years. I've seen the work that they're doing, and I don't really understand it, but you guys understand this venture capital stuff better. So why don't you sort of take a look at them? And so yeah, that's what
Amazing.
started
The
it.
power of community in,
Yeah.
both getting you deals, getting you LPs.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, yeah, and totally. Even now, I mean, a lot of the larger institutional investors that we bring in today, um, short track record is something, and strategy and thesis is important. But more important than all of that is when they are, like the difference with us is you're not investing into a business. So I can't give you financial metrics, I can't give you a growth plan. You're investing into a blind pool of capital that good capital manages. But what they do with it is then totally at their discretion. So it's a huge leap. And so it requires a lot of people who are willing to vouch for us and have seen us over the last 10, 11 years,
What is the difference between strategy and thesis?
What's the difference between strategy and thesis? I mean, I am not a huge believer in thesis, firstly. I would imagine a thesis would link more towards what is your view of how the world is going to shape up? And so, what kinds of companies do you want to invest in based on that?
Like, say, electrification,
Yeah,
like everything will move to
yeah,
electrification throughout. So you invest in EVs and battery companies and
yeah,
lithium ion
exactly.
recyclers and so on.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's the
So
thesis.
that's a thesis.
Yeah. And then the strategy becomes more around how do you source and also how do you do portfolio construction? Like to me, portfolio construction is a really big part of strategy because I think your entire strategy is based upon how you choose to construct the fund. So if we were to take a $50 million fund and decide we're going to do 25 investments a year for 3 years and then double down into 5 companies every year after that, that's a very different structure from saying I'm only going to make 6 or 7 investments a year for 3 years, and come in early, take a large stake in those early, and then maybe protect my pro rata for the next 2 rounds. So I think that ties a little bit more into strategy, at least for us.
Okay. Understood. So this high conviction come in with few checks, but come in with a bigger
That's the
check size,
strategy.
lead the round. That's the strategy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So what is so fund one was 20 million plus total with the co-investment came out to about 45 million. Tell me about the journey of fund two.
Fund 2 was a 25 million first close and will probably end up being about a $45-50 million fund. So we have until September to do that. But we started investing out of it in summer last year. I believe we've already done 8 investments. So it's a larger fund, but strategy remains the same, which is we come in as the first round investors. And this time we don't make the mistake of not being able to lead deals completely on our own. We make sure we have enough capital that we can lead. We're 80% of the round when we come in, whether it's a pre-seed round or a big seed round. So the smallest investment we've done is $100,000 investment. The largest one is about 1.4, 1.5. And in both situations, we've been over 80% of the money invested into the company at that point.
And any prominent names in these 8?
I always struggle to differentiate which one is fund 1, which one is fund 2. I'm not sure what is announced yet. So I don't know to what extent I can say. Yeah. And I would be happy to tell you all of them. I just don't want to betray the entrepreneurs who haven't done their side of the storytelling yet.
Okay. So typically, as an investor, you want to announce give that opportunity to the entrepreneur to first figure out how they want to tell the story of the funding and then back it up with your own announcement.
Yeah, I think that in general, I would, if I were, it's not about us at all. I think it's more about what makes most sense for the company. In most situations, I encourage the company to not really do anything about it because we focus, and I can come back to how our strategy forces us to find certain kinds of companies, but it largely forces us to find companies that have very little competition but have found really unique market niches. And so, if you've done that, you're operating on privileged information in a sense. And so, I think it makes sense to stay stealth as long as you can as a company. Now, companies often need help with hiring early on or giving, if they're B2B companies, giving their customers the credibility that this is a good company to do business with. And that's where fundraise announcements become really important. If you've got a candidate who's joining you, you should be Googleable and you should know that, okay, here are like 4 other reputed names who stand by this. So I think those are the only situations, at least at a very early stage, where it makes sense to do press around a fundraise.
Interesting. How do you build high conviction? You said your strategy forces you towards a particular portfolio choice, and the strategy is high conviction. So how does it happen? How do you build high conviction?
I mean, it's structural, right? So I think let's compare this strategy against a typical strategy, which is a fund that's doing 20-25 investments a year. Now, what happens and also what gets popularized in the sort of tech startup world is everyone's always excited about 2 or 3 sectors, whether it's quick commerce or it used to be ed tech or crypto or whatever. At some point, there's always a couple of hot sectors that everyone's focused on. Now, let's get into why they're hot. They're hot because the market is acknowledged as large, right? So that's risk. Market risk is often off the table. And because the market is acknowledged as large, there's a lot of capital that comes into it. Now, what follows is these are known markets with known large outcomes about to happen. So you'll have a ton of competition. You're going to have 20 credible teams going after every kind of opportunity. And the problem with that then is beyond competition is that a Series A, you've only got 6 funds in India who have major check writing capabilities. So that's a huge kind of filter off. And so if you're a seed stage fund that's making 20-25 investments a year, you can afford to pay a premium to come into these really hot sectors, because even if 80% of those bets fail because of the high failure rates, going not just from seed to A, but the inherent competition of the sector, there's high failure rates. You can eat those because your total fund over 3 years is 60 to 75 companies. If my total fund, I'm doing 6 investments a year, if my total fund is 18 companies, I have no business investing in sectors that are that hot because the failure rates would eat me up. They'd cause an existential risk. And so automatically that eliminates like 50% of where the ecosystem's energies are focused in terms of what kind of ideas am I interested in funding. It means I'm not going to be interested in funding edtech when edtech was hard, quick commerce when quick commerce was hard, social commerce when social commerce was hard. But instead, I have to focus on other niches. And there, what's ended up happening is our DNA has become to find entrepreneurs who find really interesting counterintuitive behaviors, which, if real and if extrapolated, could actually mean that there's a huge market about to be transformed or a huge market that's emerging. And so I can give you a couple. I mean, Misho is a company that everyone knows, right? And SimSim is another good example as well. But let me talk about Misho. Like Misho, I think was late 2016 or so, or maybe early 2016 when we met them. At that point, you had Flipkart, you had Snapdeal, and you had Amazon, who were already at a meaningful scale. So a new e-commerce player had no business coming in. And when we met Vidit and Sanjeev, first, they were building a hyperlocal fashion commerce app. So you'd order clothes from a store near you and they'd deliver it in 30 minutes and you pay them cash on delivery. And that business wasn't all that interesting, but like Vidit sat in the store for 6 months and he found a really unique behavior. So he found that the store owner had a son or a nephew with a smartphone who'd take pictures of all the new clothes that came in. And he'd also take all the customers who walked in their phone numbers and he'd send them any new inventory that came on WhatsApp every day. And people weren't leaving these groups. So if you added me in 2016 to a group like that, I'd never seen, now you see them all the time, but at the time I'd never seen this kind of group chat behavior. And so people were not leaving the groups. They were interested. They were going back and forth. And then we found that a lot of the people in the groups were actually housewives who had come in. They created their own pages on Facebook pages. I think the product was called then. Now it's all migrated to WhatsApp. And they would post the products that were coming and they would sell them. So they were drop shipping these products. And it was fascinating because they weren't drop shipping into the void. They were drop shipping to their first degree and second degree network. So these are known people within communities. And essentially, what they were short circuiting was the trust problem. Now, people didn't want to buy things online because they didn't trust that it would be as advertised and also that it would be suitable for them or not or whatnot. But now you have someone that you know that is a friend of a friend and kind of knows about you. And it's conversational, they're helping you along, and they're dealing with the complexity of going to the website, placing the order, putting the address, and making sure it arrives, putting in the payments and all of that. So I think on the one hand, it was quite interesting on the demand side because the trust problem was being filled. On the supply side, it let you tap into the long tail of these local shops. So people who did well on Amazon, Flipkart, Snapdeal at the time were, if you look up an item and it appears on the first, like top 10 of search results. But the long tail would not thrive on these platforms at all. So suddenly here was a platform, a product, not even a platform at that time, that was helping you get distribution. And actually, it's funny because we've just invested in we just invested in a hyper local like commerce company, which is about 2 or 3 years after it's been a hot sector, and obviously like Zepto and Blinkit have done incredibly well. But we've come across another approach which is very similar in the sense that it it aggregates a lot of the long tail, which doesn't do well on these major platforms.
And what's it doing for demand? I mean, supply in a marketplace, is supply like a competitive advantage?
It's doing interesting things for demand as well. I don't know to what extent I should get into them right now, but essentially it lowers a lot of the friction um, for a segment of the user audience that's not well served by a Blinkit or a Zepto. But yeah, I think supply is totally a structural advantage for a business in the marketplace sector. And the reason for that is that India is an economy of really small businesses, unlike the US or other developed countries. And so structurally small businesses will have to be supported because they are the ones that are driving the economy, and they are like individual entrepreneurs and SMEs are willing to do a lot of heavy lifting and work really hard for a small amount of sales. And so to engineers, it's often not attractive to build software for a really long tail. And I think generally in markets, what we've seen is the like where the meat of the Pareto is get saturated first, and then the long tail get tapped a little bit later. But the long tail is where, like in Misho's case, right, in fashion commerce, 90% of fashion sales in India was unbranded products. So that's all long tail. So the low hanging fruit is the brands and the larger players. But as you develop into a sector, you're going to need to actually tap into the long tail. And I would argue that the long tail is the larger part of the market.
Yeah, Shopify is essentially the product for the long tail in e-commerce.
Yeah, in other markets more so, but yeah, totally.
Yeah, in other markets.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. How do you do you have a framework that these things need to be in place for us to have high conviction?
No, not at all.
So, okay. So in every investment, it's like a real deep dive to understand what they're doing, and then apply the filter of your own experience of past investments and your understanding of India as a market, and then figure out what is it that you're figuring out. Are you figuring out, will they raise the next round at a higher valuation? Is that the question
No,
you're answering?
in fact, we end up passing on a lot of companies where we're like, okay, these guys are doing something interesting. They'll certainly be able to raise the next round. I just don't know whether this is a large enough uh, business at scale. And often that's in sectors that are hot, right? There's just momentum. You can raise capital. Um, but like that peters out at some point. Uh, so to your question, I would say yes, it is a deep dive on each business. It's not as much putting it in the context of what are the structural macro drivers in India? Where does this market go in 10 years? It's more just can you find a really unique behavior that shows you that your understanding of how a huge organized sector operates and is normal is actually not. It's the total opposite, that people might actually prefer a totally different way of doing things. So in Misho's case, it was the fact that, um, sure, on there was a huge long tail. That thesis came a little bit later, but the behavior was just interesting that you had someone sitting for 4 hours a day taking screenshots of clothes, putting them onto a Facebook Pages page, trying to sell it, and then people actually buying it. It showed that people wanted to do commerce this way. For me, I'd rather have gone to a marketplace, typed in exactly what I wanted, ordered it, and not have to think about it and it arrives. Here, people wanted to have 2 hours, 3 hours of conversation to buy something, which was a completely different behavior to what would have been expected. And I think retrospectively, I can look back and understand it a little bit better as to why that was. And you draw parallels to how you had self serve models and then sales assisted models and all of that. But at the time, it's just you find a really unique and strange behavior. And you say, what if we're totally wrong? And mostly people prefer this thing, but the whole world has been building the other thing. And people are using the other thing because they didn't know that this is preferred. So I'd say that's kind of a common theme in a lot of our
But
investing.
the insight alone does not lead to high conviction. You can the team build it? Is the market large enough? I mean, these things also would be
Yeah, I
important
mean, look,
factors,
market
right?
sizing is something that is to me, it's a really strange topic because I think it's a really silly question early on when people say, is the market large enough? Because the market's not defined. If you're doing something that's changing the way things work, that's like changing a sector of the world in a way, then obviously there's no heuristics to be able to calculate how large the market is because it hasn't been created yet. Retrospectively, you can look back, like even if you look at something like an Oyo, right? That market didn't exist. It was a new model, or an Airbnb. It was a new model. And so I don't think
Yeah,
you
you're
can do
right.
that.
You're
I
right.
think you
Yeah.
can find,
Anyone who followed the market sizing approach would have passed on Airbnb. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah,
I think
yeah.
you find, I think the like how latent that behavior is and how strong and sticky it is really important. So the at that time when we spoke to Misho, there were 32 people who had the Misho app and were selling through Misho. And so I spoke to a bunch of them and they loved it. And they'd have long conversations about why they would much rather sell on a product like this than a Snapdeal or an Amazon. And so they were invested in making sure it would be successful. So you certainly have to extrapolate what would the world look like if this behavior is true at some kind of scale. But I think it's hard to start mapping it into a market size. I try never to do any market sizing predictions, to be honest.
And what about evaluating the team?
Yeah, I mean, look, evaluating the team's capability to build something is an easier one. I feel like if they are mainly what you're screening for is growth. So anyone who's coming to you should already have a prototype, should already have customers. Even idea stage people should have mock-ups or something like that. So I think in we're fortunate in that in this industry, you're typically dealing with really intelligent people. And so the question that you can't answer is, are they able to grow as people, as managers? And that's stuff that you have to worry about Series B and beyond, not really before that. And I think that's so hard to judge that you don't try and judge that. But in terms of, are they good enough to build the product? They should have the product built. They should be hacking things around every week and creating new things. So if they're not, like, if someone is coming with a strategy and pitching a strategy, that's an automatic no. If people are pitching a market opportunity and pitching it top down, so they're talking about macro drivers first and then getting to a solution, that's like 9 out of 10 times a no. To me, the most interesting thing is when people are bottom up focused. They're focused on problem much more than solution, and on being able to describe the problem really vividly and really deeply. That gives you the sense that they understand the customer well, incredibly well. So I think that's a good proxy for being able to do it.
Okay, fascinating. Misho has changed their model now, right? From what I read in the news, this original model is no longer what they're doing. They're more like a proper, full-fledged e-commerce business now.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. I think that kind of happens at scale. Business models will keep changing. I think they've had major changes to the business a couple times, and have both times led them onto a more constructive path and towards a larger outcome than previously imagined. So I think the way I see it is, the world is dynamic in the sense that the idea that you start with on day one is not what you're going to scale. You're not going to be heads down and keep scaling that. As you grow, there, like, your scale, your structural moats let you do other interesting things. So if there's bigger
What
opportunities,
was
they'll
their
always go for it.
first pivot?
So the first pivot was actually that they started as and in fact, in my old emails, I look back and I described it as a product suite to help people sell things on WhatsApp. So you would,
Right.
like, because you would get photos of products and then people would write a description. And so what it did was you could upload all of the photos into the Misho app along with the description, along with the inventory. And then if you wanted to sell it, you would click share to WhatsApp. It would create a composite of all of that with the description, with a payment link that would come to your account. Um, but it didn't have anything on the inventory side. So it didn't have a supply side. So they operated just as the sales enablement product. And
Okay.
then I think maybe a year and a half later, they launched something called Misho Supply, where they started tying up with wholesalers and retailers for those guys to list their inventory. So you would list on Misho Supply, and then the housewives would be on Misho, and they'd see the products listed on the supply side and they'd choose to market them. So it streamlined the supply chain a little bit. And then in time, they shut down the Misho app and they renamed Misho Supply to Misho. So that was the early
Okay,
pivot.
okay, okay. And now they are doing direct to customer logistics, fulfillment. They've built all of those capabilities, and
Yeah, I think, look, their structural moat is that they have a lot of suppliers who are local. And so if you're ordering a product, it should show you suppliers who are in regions close to you rather than coming from across the country, which will add a lot to the shipping costs and things like that. So they have regional supply chains.
that's why they built their own logistics solution to kind of help bring in the efficiency of local matchmaking.
Yeah, I think the more depth you have into how a product is moving across the supply chain, the better you can predict timing and and mitigate errors and reduce costs. So that's sort of the path that they've been. I think that lets them do that.
Okay. Understood. Interesting. Are there, bad bets that you took you don't want to name names,
Yeah.
but just as an example of what you learned from that, like you thought this was a good bet because of ABC, but it turned out that you were wrong in something and what you learned. And
So many bad bets. Where do I start? Let me try and think of a couple specific ones so that I can give you a good example without naming it. I think the biggest mistake we've ever made has been to get swept away in the excitement around companies and rely on borrowed conviction, which is the number one thing I talk about not doing. And it's probably as a result of that. And I think a less intuitive mistake that we've made a couple of times now is we've come across companies we've liked that are doing something interesting, which we have rising conviction on. And, our approach is to find people in our network who can help these companies, who can also give us an opinion on these companies. And there have been a couple of times where there's people we really trust and have even been founders of portfolio companies that have done really well for us, that know a sector inside out. And because of their in-depth knowledge of a sector, they've given us 10 reasons why something can't work. And then we've listened to that. And so I think that's part of the journey of being
that's your anti-portfolio,
yeah.
where you
So
said no, even though you thought this is a good investment, but you were influenced by the feedback of somebody from the space.
somebody who knew the space better than we did. So that's what definitely cuts both ways. And I think that's part of the issue, right? As an entrepreneur, I find that the best startups have been from people in their mid to maybe late 20s who are really strong technologists, product people, good at go to market, but may not know the sector as well or the challenges of the sector as well. And so it's their stubborn force of will that eventually just surpasses what would have been problems in the business. So I've seen that a couple of times. So that's kind of the path, a narrow path to try and walk, which is be open to feedback and input, but also know that it comes from that each data point is from someone's individual perspective and their own journey.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for counterintuitive insights, then possibly an insider who's been building in that space for a while
Yeah.
would not have that insight.
Yeah.
Otherwise, he would have already built on it.
Yeah.
So
Well, they definitely don't have that insight, but then are they able to take in something new that's changed? Like, can they take in that new piece of information and extrapolate that or project that onto the sector and say, could this make sense? And now I've started to find that the common feedback in those kinds of situations when it's negative, the negative feedback doesn't actually head on take the approach of the business. It just focuses on other structural problems within the industry.
Give me an example.
How do I do this without naming? I mean, okay, so like in e-commerce, for instance, there have been a couple companies that have tried to do mass. You've got the PDD model in China.
Yeah, group buying.
Yeah, and so group buying is a certain behavior, and then part of it also works because you've got really developed logistics infrastructure in China, and so costs of shipment as a share of the total basket value stay low even for low ticket items if your cost of shipping across the country is low. In the past, it didn't used to be low in India, and so I've definitely missed a company that did really well because of where shipping costs were at that point, and knowing and feeling like I know that it's not going to come below a certain threshold that makes sense, and combined with the idea that a lot of the products behind the PDD came from like manufacturing surplus, for instance. So you had a lot of spare product at scale, which manufacturers would be willing to sell at a lower price than what would make sense. And that insight turned out to not entirely be true and actually created other opportunities. Like that wasn't the thing that stopped a business in that sector from working.
Okay. I want to kind of end with an observation which I've made over so many interviews is that the folks who are running VC funds tend to be some of the most uh, intelligent people that I've interviewed. Not only intelligence, but it's also the fact that they are so aware. How does that happen? Like, how did you get to where you are today, where you can talk as fluently about a PDD and apply that example to India? And so how do you reach that level of that level of being able to look at big picture, zoom into small picture, being able to draw insights, being able to make mental models?
Well, I think it's quite a double-edged sword because, like I was saying, I mean, if you summarize my answer to the last one, a simple, maybe misleading summary of it is that the more you know about a sector, the less you're going to be able to make good predictions about it. So I think it's a little bit tough, and I try not to go too deep on like building expertise within sectors for that reason. And certainly investments I've made that, or investments which have not done well, have been partly because I've understood a prior business maybe better than or a prior industry better than I should have. I think it's maybe a lot of VCs are good generalists. So they read broadly, they develop mental models from, at least for me, I develop a lot of mental models from other academic disciplines, and then you use those to apply to business theory rather than fixating too much on.
Give me an example of this, like taking a mental model from.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, earlier in the conversation, we talked a little bit about, you asked about the power of community, and then I talked more about it being a network of nodes and then how you try and build up a network. And if you are generous about bringing people who are doing interesting things together and just getting them to talk, then interesting things sort of happen, and you can't determine them predictably, but you just know at a macro level that they will happen. And that kind of just goes back to chemistry, collision theory, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Like evolution is a good way to look at how we talked about finding opportunities in niches that are underexploited but develop something really strange and different. And if that mutation, you want to call it, is really powerful, then it can proceed past a local maximum to a more global maximum, and that's an interesting opportunity. So I think there's a lot of like fundamental things that we learn in school that we forget about, which if you take them outside of their subject and apply them more broadly, I think they get quite interesting.
What kind of content do you consume to keep yourself smart and updated?
Too much, and I'm having eye trouble now. I've been told by my eye doctor that I'm not blinking enough because I spend too much time in front of the screen. What kind of content am I consuming? There's so much. I can pull up some of my kind of favorite subscriptions. There's, why don't I just pull them out and read out a little? I think there's a lot of breadth to this. There's The Diff by Byrne Hobart. There's The Browser.
These are newsletters? Or?
Yeah, they're a mix of newsletters and RSS feeds.
Okay.
There's The Browser, which is nothing to do with tech, but quite broad. There's Money Stuff by Matt Levine. Eric Newcomer does some interesting stuff. What else do we have? Unsupervised learning is a really fascinating one. There's a firm called NZS Capital, Stuff I Learned Last Week. It's called SITAL Week, which is a great newsletter. Benedict Evans does some tech stuff.
Well, fascinating. Cool. Thank you so much for your time, Arjun.
Thank you.
Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
This was fun. Thank you for doing it.